Well, good evening, everyone. It is so lovely to have you all gathered here for this special oration this evening. My name's Tracy Burton. I'm the Chief Executive of Uniting at New South Wales and ACT. And on behalf of the board and the leadership team at Uniting, I'm so privileged to be your MC tonight and to welcome you all here tonight. We have a lovely way to start this evening. We have Uncle Alan has been able to join us, Uncle Alan Murray. He's been very much in demand. He's just come from a special ceremony and now he's here to provide us with a welcome before he heads off down to the Opera House. So we're very, very grateful. Uncle Alan is the chairperson of the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council and is able to welcome us here tonight. So thank you, Uncle Alan.
Good evening, how are you? I need to have this conversation around what had occurred, and I suppose want to thank the 45% who voted for us for the referendum. The other people don't know why. Perhaps there's a message in that, but certainly truth-telling is part of our, I suppose, renewal. This is my fourth welcome to country today, and I'm just trying to get this message right. It's about activation of our lands. It's about activating different plans in order to get the right results. It's not closing the gap, but it's activating those plans in order to get equity. It's been a heartfelt result on the 14th. Having spent 10 days in London, in the UK, to return some old people from country over there, going to the fatherland, coming back to the motherland, opposite way, and returning people back to Barossa, Julian. So we've had 2 male Aboriginal people were taken away in the 1850s, so we've gone over there to get them. One of those things about our people, we are so resilient, but we still are concerned. There are thousands and thousands of our artefacts and our people overseas. When you finish here with the Welcome to Country, please have a prayer for our people. We are the first and we will be the last. We are the first, we've been here for 65,000 years. When I was doing Welcome to Countries before the 14th, I was saying 65,000 years plus one day, getting nearer to the 14th. What a profound disappointment. And I'm starting to reach out to corporate and places like yourselves to get an understanding, because if our people have been suffering then on the 14th, our people are suffering now because of the issues, what had occurred and what was going to be the result. Imagine this, all the Aboriginal organisations and all the Aboriginal communities in Northern Territory voted yes against those who feel that it's not a right to have, or try to say, race. It's clear that the powers across the road here in Macquarie Street have the same issues. So I want to put it out to now is that I want to pay respects to Padikaram, Bangaroo, Pamoe and Muscata. These are our legendary warriors who fought for this country. Who fought for this country. This is where colonisation took place. And we need to move on, because I feel that injustice has occurred. I was not one of those leaders who said you need to, be silent. I continue to speak out for our people. And that's what I do as chair of the Metropolitan Local Land Council. And I would like to see more opportunities. I know there is goodwill with the New South Wales Parliament, New South Wales Government, and also the Labor Parliament. And they're reaching out. So, and with that, I'll pay respects to yourselves for being here to honour this great man, like other great men who pioneered opportunities for this country. And like myself, I want to make sure that our children and children gets the right results. So with that, have a great evening and thank you very much.
It seems right that we're here tonight to reflect back on the wonderful work of Reverend Harry Herbert, because I can only imagine how he would have lent into these last months leading up to the 14th of October. He would have brought all of his social justice capabilities to a very, very worthy endeavour. As I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands, that's the Gadigal people, and so to have had Uncle Alan here today at this incredibly heartbreaking time for him to welcome us, but to stop and reflect and pay our respect and acknowledgement to all elders, those of the past, those of the present, our great hopes for the leaders who will come through and actually shift us beyond where we are today. And a special acknowledgement and a welcome to Aboriginal people who are in the room with us today. It's an enormously difficult time. Following the lead of the Uniting Church, Uniting definitely got in behind the Yes campaign and fought as hard as we could and tried to influence as much as we could, along with many, many other organisations. We trained we actually got to educate almost 2,000 of our people about why Uniting and the Uniting Church was wanting to be strong allies and walk alongside the Yes campaign. It does seem like a terribly significant missed opportunity, and it's going to be a reckoning for us as a country. So how we can actually grab a hold of that and convert that into action. On to treaty and truth next. That's the big challenge for us, and I think we couldn't be in a better room than where we are tonight to be listening to the speakers that we have tonight to help us think about how we can keep working so hard to try and shift the dial and close those gaps. We're here together tonight because we are going to be listening and learning, and I think be inspired to work together to create real and structural change that is going to tackle intergenerational disadvantage. We have with us a renowned leader in this space, Charlie Leadbeater, who's visiting from the UK, a renowned policy advisor, writer and social innovator, who I think maybe preempting, is going to give us a bit of a call to action. And we have some other really special guests here with us tonight. We have some of our political leaders, and if we're going to change systems, it's going to take all of us working together. So to have Sarah Kane, MLC here, and Julian Leeser here, the federal member for Barara, to have so many leaders, be they board members or service leaders, executive members from a variety of the social impact organisations across Australia. We have the leader of our Uniting Church here, the moderator, who you will hear from later. Marta is here with us. We have representatives of the Uniting Church. We have two incredibly special guests, and that is Meg Herbert and her and Harry's daughter, Catherine, are here tonight, because tonight is very much about honouring the legacy of Reverend Harry Herbert. He was indeed a force for nature and a tireless campaigner. He championed the voices of people who typically didn't get to have their voice heard. He campaigned on so many fronts. He campaigned for radical social change around LGBTIQ+ rights, gun control, abortion rights, and indeed backing in First Nations lands rights. And, you know, on top of that incredibly significant social justice record, he really had a massive impact in the drug law reform space as well. Harry was inspired by the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and it's so lovely that we have some representatives from Melbourne, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, who had created this model which was about research and advocacy and service delivery. So inspired by that, Harry actually created Uniting Care, which of course we now all know as Uniting New South Wales and ACT. And in that drug law reform space, in that drug treatment space, as he saw the heroin overdose deaths really spiralling out of control in the 1990s, he steadfastly campaigned for a different policy approach. He steadfastly campaigned to create what we all now know today as the Uniting Medically Supervised Injecting Centre and I understand that he actually considered this to be one of his greatest achievements. And some of those issues that I've referenced there might seem a bit mainstream today, but back then they were very bold, they were very radical. And of course, as we will reflect later in the evening about political leadership and leadership in those difficult spaces, he was able to really tirelessly campaign for radical social change. And of course, that was often polarising and sometimes came at a cost in terms of his relationships with other parts of the community, with other parts of the church. So through all of that boldness and challenge, he actually has been proven right. His campaign propositions, absolutely, those platforms were exactly right. And so tonight is very much about reflecting back on some of that, but also about taking us forward, about how we might partner today, how we might collaborate to make sure that we can continue to see radical social change. I think Harry definitely would have acknowledged that anything that he achieved in those social impact spaces was not ever done alone. So you're all incredibly welcome here tonight, especially our speakers and our special guests. It really is very good of you to come out. And our very first speaker today is Amy Robertson. Amy is a lifelong citizen of southwest Sydney. She's worked passionately across youth work and in the education sector for, would you believe, the past 19 years. She's been supporting young people in many, many capacities, helping them with homelessness, mental health and education. So Amy is a proud and passionate voice for community-led change. In her current role as Strategy and Partnership Coordinator at Uniting for the Maximising the Middle, she's bringing passionate people and organisations together at the community level to make stronger communities to benefit the young people who are aged between the 8 to 14, hence the Maximising the Middle. We're hoping to set them up so that they can actually thrive in their teams. It's going to be lovely to hear from you, Amy, so please come and join me at the lectern.
Thank you, everyone. Always very nervous when I do this, but I'm excited as well. Picture this, walking home from school through an open bushland, trees standing tall and houses surrounding. I can smell a barbecue, sausages maybe, coming from the youth centre. As I get closer, I can see it's packed with young people of all ages, playing basketball out the back. I continue my journey. I pass the neighbourhood centre, maybe drop in for some homework assistance. As I approach my street, it's filled with young children playing soccer in the street. They are active and creative. They've made soccer goals out of whatever material they can find. I might drop in and say hi to all of my neighbours who, like my parents, do a lot of volunteer work. One fosters several children. All these things signify a strong community and contribute to why I am a well-rounded adult. Over the years, the community spirit got stronger and stronger. Then one day, years back, we were told our community could be rebuilt better. They came to consult, but they didn't really listen. 2023 rolls around, and I come to watch as they demolish my family home. The shutters my dad had painted and added to the house. The garage awning he built and we put in together. The letterbox he created, an exact replica of our home, antenna and all. When they demolished our homes, they gutted our community, ignored our collective identity. They could do this because the community I grew up in was Claymore, a suburb of Campbelltown. You probably know it as a community housing estate. And although they had the power to move us out of Claymore, it was our collective grassroots power that brought us together and created our neighbourhood identity, and the one that in particular I am proud of. I consider myself lucky to have grown up in Claymore. I drew on the strengths of my parents, who were leaders in our community. I could name 1,000 things my parents, who were leaders in the community, did. My dad and my mum, my dad and my mum. They did to help shape parts of this community through their constant commitment to community. My dad built the interior of the local laundromat. My mum made the Claymore Dream Park come alive, like it was brought to life by the power of my mum. All these things had massive impact. Through these constant acts of giving, they helped to unite a neighbourhood that was previously divided. My parents taught us the power of motivation to improve your situation, even when you don't have much to give on paper. They didn't just tell us, they showed us through the tireless commitment to the people of Claymore. They inspired me to lead and be part of the Claymore Youth Centre and dedicate my life and work to help young people realise and own their strengths and goals. That's how I ended up here, talking to you today. As for Claymore, it lives on in the weekly community meetups. Hot meals, organised by the community and services. When people are leaders in their own communities, they have a power that can't be replicated. They know, understand, and can empathise with the complicated challenges and barriers their peers are facing. They have motivation to succeed that is fueled by making differences for their families and neighbours, not for accolades or for statuses. I'm looking forward to hearing you talk, Charlie. But I read your quote, I'm sure everyone else did in this room too. The most impressive people I've met are innovative practitioners, head teachers, police officers, doctors, who are trying to turn bold ideas into practical actions for public good. I've learned that small can be big when ideas reshape entire systems. With all due respect, Charlie, I challenge you to go one step further. Because to me, the most impressive people I've met are not the doctors and police officers. They are the ordinary people who we as society often look down on. Look a little bit closer. You'll see in every one of these disadvantaged communities, people are leaders, working tirelessly and often for free to create better futures for their own people. I truly believe success lies in tapping into that power. Thank you, everyone.
Amy, your mum and dad must be so proud of you, and thank you for bringing it right to us to recognise that, in fact, listening to the people in the community, they are the real change makers. They really are powerful. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Please join me in thanking Amy again. So now it is going to be wonderful to have Charlie Leadbeater come and join us to give us a presentation. Charlie has had a diverse and distinguished career, working in a number of different ways across policy and social innovation. He started his career as a television researcher and then as a print journalist for the Financial Times and for The Independent. Later, Charlie went on to write speeches and white papers and strategy papers for Tony Blair's Labor government, and then policy papers and reports for think tanks such as Demos, the Centre of London, and our very own Australian Centre for Social Innovation. He later founded a design agency called Participate and one called Alt Now to help organisations design and drive social innovation. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Leadbeater to the stage.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's good to see all of you, because if you weren't here, it'd be pretty empty. And thank you to Uncle Alan for that gracious and immensely patient welcome. Thank you to the Board of Uniting for inviting me, and to Harry's family, to Meg and Catherine for giving me the honour of giving this ovation in his name. I hope I can do some justice to the practical sense of moral passion that obviously coursed through his work. As someone who worked for him, who I talked to earlier, said he was a giant. And thank you, Tracy, for that very deft description of my career that's, what did you call it? Diverse, I think. Career can mean a sort of orderly progression of jobs ever upward, or it can mean losing control on the corner of a hairpin bend and going off it. And my career has been both those things. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to give this short talk. It's made me reflect on what on earth it is that I've been doing all these years, a question which still befuddles my children, who would roll their eyes to hear me talk. And thank you, Amy, for that fantastically thoughtful and heartfelt provocation, which provides us with the starting point, because that's really where my story with all this started. It started with working with social entrepreneurs and community activists and community builders who I found all over the place in the UK, who were doing amazing things. They were creating new ways for people to work, to build and own their own homes, or provide care or develop learning. And they did it by, at the same time, generating social capital. So they didn't just create or deliver services, they created bigger outcomes and bigger networks of power and trust, as Amy's talked about. And in the process, they often saved the public sector vast sums of money and generated value in all sorts of untold and unexpected ways. And what happened to them? By and large, they got nowhere. By and large, when they tried to replicate or scale up or provide insights or lessons into the approach they'd taken, they were largely rejected, sidelined, ignored, marginalized, looked down upon by systems that they thought they were trying to help. And that was partly because those systems are really obdurate. They're really entrenched. They're often deeply self-interested. They're more interested in themselves and the conditions for their success than they are in changing the lives of the people they serve. But what started to dawn on me was that the conversation that we have in the community and social sector about scale, how do we scale things, is exactly the wrong kind of debate, really. Because what these people were trying to do was not just scale things, they were trying to shift things. They were trying to shift the fundamental underlying principles on which public purpose solutions were built. And that was why the systems rejected them, because they could see that challenge in the shift in principles that they were implying. So as a result of that, I became really interested in people who got beyond that, who weren't ignored, who did bring larger change, who weren't marginalized, and who could work their way into systems, over systems, underneath systems, you name it. So I'm afraid, Amy, I am going to talk about a doctor, a police officer, and a social activist. And I'm going to talk briefly about the shifts these people brought about, and then say a little bit about how they did it. So let me quickly introduce you to our cast of three. The first is a man called Alvaro Salas. Alvaro Salas is an extraordinary man. He was born in rural Costa Rica in a tiny village in the mid-1950s, and he was lucky to reach his first birthday because at that time in Costa Rica, deaths before one were so common that cemeteries had separate sections for babies under the year of one. It was a sort of carnage. Communicable disease was rife. Life expectancy was 18 years less than United States. And the nearest hospital to the place that Alvaro was born was 40 kilometers away. He wanted to become a doctor as a result. So he did train to become a doctor, and he went to work in a place called Punta Arenas, where 2 new barrios were being created. And in those barrios of El Roble, he managed to persuade the local community and the health system to give him enough money to create a single-room community health centre with a nurse, a doctor, a social worker, and a public health advocate. And with the community there, he built a model of how a community health centre and a mixed team could work with a community of about 7,000 people. And over time, long story, he became eventually in charge of both social security, social care and health spending in Costa Rica, and created an amazing merged service called eBase, which funds hundreds of these community-based health centres with at their heart a new kind of health worker, an ITAP, who literally carries the health service on his back in a backpack with a motorbike. And as Alvaro says about his work in El Roble, he said, I knew everyone. So I knew who was pregnant. I knew who had dementia. So I knew where we needed to go. So instead of a health service that just responds when people are sick, I knew where we had to go to make sure that people felt healthy. So now, Costa Rica, it's extremely uncommon for a baby to die before their first birthday. Communicable disease has been eradicated. Male life expectancy is 2 years greater than the United States. The biggest gains in healthcare have been amongst the poorest populations. The healthcare gradient in Costa Rica is the same as the Nordic countries, and Costa Rica has a GDP per capita 1/6 of the United States. So Alvaro Salas, with eBase and ITAP, the community-based healthcare system that he created, managed a shift. That health wasn't about doctors and hospitals, it could be about communities and these mixed teams. The second shift is a guy called Alet Mansky. Alet Mansky was a sort of social activist, community worker. His daughter was born with severe learning disabilities. With a group of other parents, he became absolutely horrified by the services provided to these families. Not just what they did, but the tone and the assumptions. And the assumptions were, these people don't know. They can't know. They're incapable. They need looking after. And so perhaps with the best intentions, they did things to them, and which denied their capacity to have any choice. So Al started by doing sit-ins. He campaigned against bad services. Then with a group of parents, he devised an alternative approach to services where formal and informal services work together, where the relationship between the young person, the family, and the care worker became more like a team, more integrated and fluid. He created a new legal framework for care so that relationships could become recognised in Canadian law, and he organised a new kind of funding system in which billions of Canadian dollars now flows into a version of a savings plan for these young people. So he made a shift from assuming people can't and they have no choice and voice to assuming they can, that they're capable and they deserve to live independently, and that we have many different versions of the good life. And finally, Karen McCluskey. Karen McCluskey was the police officer promoted to be in charge of the centre of Glasgow. She got this promotion just as Glasgow acquired the reputation for being the murder capital of Europe. And it was the murder capital of Europe because young men were knifing one another on the streets of Glasgow, often in broad daylight on shopping streets in front of passing shoppers. Karen realised that her job was simply going to be making it a little bit better and stopping it getting worse. But if she carried on doing what she was already doing just a little bit better, there was no way out for the young people, for the families, for the city. So she decided to persuade them, the whole city, not just the police, to see it in a different way. And by that she meant, what if we treated this not like a crime that you had to then respond to, but like a disease that you had to prevent? What if this was more like a virus? What if we cut it out at source and its transmission within families and between families? And so instead of it just being a police issue or a courts issue, what if this was also about social services, education, housing cooperating? What if it was about churches and employers? What if you got dentists to fix people's teeth and vets to warn you when there was violence against jobs? In other words, what if you created an entire coalition of actors across the city to prevent violence and crime? Not to respond to it once it's happened, to prevent it. Knife crime in Glasgow over the following decade after Karen embarked on this full-scale effort plummeted. It's now one of the safest cities in Europe, and Karen is asked to go and talk in cities all over the world about this shift from treating it like an individual crime to seeing it as if it's a kind of disease, a culture. So what did these three people who have created such impressive public outcomes, what did they do? What were their, if you like, their common factors? I'm just going to give you four that I think are central. The first is they go beyond. And by that, I mean they go beyond the status quo. They go beyond an acceptance that reality as it is how it has to be, because it's always been and you can't change it. So they go beyond thinking that conventional wisdom is all we have and we can perhaps get to the leading edge of it. And they imagine a different and better possibility, and they persuade people of that. They go beyond the problem to think about the possibility. Too often with these things, we think about the problem so much that we get drawn back into the problem and the systems that created the problem. The problem creates no energy, no motivation, no forward thinking. It's the possibility of a better health service, a healthier society, a safer city, a better life that propelled people onwards. And they go beyond conventional measures of value. And what they're doing when they go beyond is pointing to value that people don't see in the numbers, the targets, the costs on spreadsheets. They go to a value which is something more, something deeper. So the second thing they do is they all go deep. So if you want to go beyond, you have to go deep. And they went deep in three different ways. They went deep because they have a kind of social philosophy that they believe in, a set of principles about how they think people want to live full and flourishing lives. In a sense, they were all moral pioneers. They were pioneers not just of new services, but of a new sense of what a good life could be. Most obviously, in the case of Al, who, with a group of other people in Canada, promoted this idea of independent living and people having choice and voice. They go deeper because they're not satisfied with superficial solutions. They go deeper to look for fundamental causes, and they go deeper to ask fundamental questions about who has power. So in Karen's case, she wasn't satisfied with a better policing solution in her box. She wanted to understand where the violence was coming from and how you could cut it out. And they go deeper because they articulate deep forces within society. If you want to bring about change, you can't do it just as a set of actions. You have to be almost carried by forces within society which you can articulate. In Alvaro's case, that was a demand for living better and living healthier, longer lives, a sense that Costa Rica wanted to get beyond where it was. So, if you want to go beyond, and you have to go beyond where we are to get to better, you have to go deeper. Going deeper means asking difficult questions about causes, about power, about underlying principles. The third thing they all did is they all went wide. They all adopted a wide lens on their problem and the potential solutions. So why did they go wide? Well, big change never comes from a single point. It never comes from a single service, a piece of technology, a product, or an organization. It never comes from a single point in a hierarchy, even if you're at the top of it. Big change always comes from complementary innovations coming together. Karen made Glasgow safe by getting an entire alliance of people to see that that was their job. It wasn't just the job of the police, and that her job was to knit all of that together. Alvaro understood that actually you needed health and social care, and you needed the support of the community and insights from families to knit together an effective health system. But you need to go wide, because if you're not in positions of power in hierarchies, then the only power you have is the power of with. It's the power of bringing people together laterally and creating coalitions and movements. So they were all adept at the power that comes from bringing people together. And finally, you need to go wide because you see further if you go wide. Because the more points of insight and learning you have, the more you will see, the more you will realize what is possible and what is out there. The narrower your point of view, the narrower the perspective, the learning, the more limited your imagination will be. If you want to expand the possibility, you have to expand the numbers of points of view, and that includes points of view which are not yours, which will come from different vantage points and different experiences, including lived experience. And the final thing they did is they all went long. So the reason you need to go wide is you need to go long, because actually change never happens in one electoral cycle, it never happens in one chief executive cycle, it never happens in any of the funding cycles of any of the philanthropy organizations, any of the governments that fund it. So systems are obdurate, they're deeply entrenched. It takes time to unlock and unpeel them. So that requires patience. Systems are complex. It requires bringing together different kinds of components and learning through change as a continual process rather than something you do at an artificial point at the end. And you need to go long because whatever purpose you start with is probably going to change. So the idea that you set purpose and then you march with a purpose in mind is, in my view, completely wrong for most social challenges. Actually, you discover purpose as you go, as the alliance broadens, as your understanding deepens, as the possibility opens up. So you need to go long to allow change to unfold. All of these people would say, after decades, that their work is unfinished. Alvaro Salas has been at this for 50 years. And he would say it's a daily battle to defend community healthcare against acute medical health services. Alec Mansky and Karen McCluskey, likewise, would say it's never finished. You never arrive at some point where everything is settled. It's a continual dynamic and a continual growth. So if you really want to bring about change, it seems to me that you need to go beyond. And to go beyond, you need to invest in the imagination, look at things from new perspectives, take in ideas from subcultures or margins or places that aren't close to the mainstream. You need to go deep, which means asking fundamental questions about causes, underlying philosophy and principles. You need to go wide to assemble coalitions that bring together the complementary innovations and the power for change that's needed. And those coalitions, importantly, and this is partly an answer to you, Amy, always have to include people inside systems. The myth that all the people inside the system are bad is a myth. Systems are full of really good people trying to do good jobs. Actually, if you want to change them, you have to win over a good chunk of the existing system as well as campaign against it. And you need to go long to sustain change over a set of waves, not even one single wave, but passing the baton between many people. So I think these people matter, and I think they matter because we need power in society. We need power to do anything, to make it better. And the kind of power that they're trying to tell us about is not the power we're used to. The thing about power is that it can all too easily turn bad. We know what bad power looks like. There are so many examples of bad power. Bad power is unaccountable, it operates behind closed doors, it serves itself, it's extractive. And we know what good power should be like. It should be open, accountable, it should be shared, generative, it should grow beyond itself with a larger purpose. Bad power is held over people. Good power is created with people. It is a power that replicates and generates. And what these people have done is show how you can sow the seeds of good power in systems that encourage its growth. They represent a kind of power which is, in a way, I feel redemptive, reparative, regenerative. And they bring to mind a word I think you used, Tracy, in the introduction. They bring to mind love and the relationship between love and power, famously characterized by Martin Luther King. Love without power can be sentimental. Power without love can be harsh, but when love and power are combined, they can be transformational. And so I'm interested in these people because I think they bring love and power together. So, Amy, I hope that's answered at least why I'm interested in the people that I'm interested in. And to Meg and Catherine, I hope that you feel that you can see Harry in these stories and you can see that people are following in the footsteps that he laid out, that we can believe in good power, and that power can be redemptive, reparative, and regenerative. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Sometimes when we get to talk about systems change and systems, they're ubiquitous and it feels esoteric. But I think what you've done today was really, through the stories of Alan and of Vera and of Karen, demystify some of that and give us some clues about how we too can become change makers. And I think as you talk about going deep, going beyond, going wide and going long, it does remind us of the Reverend Harry Herbert's work as well. So thank you so much. My name's Tammy Pararajasingam. I'm the General Manager of Impact and Innovation at Uniting, and it's now my delight to invite our panellists to stage. Please join us, guys. And I'll introduce them as they join us. James, Tharani, Mark and Charlie, please join us now. James is the Deputy Secretary of Housing, Disability and District Services, as well as Disaster Welfare at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. And as part of that, he covers the tenancy management of 100,000 homes. Prior to being at DCJ, James was also the CEO of Mission Australia, and it's lovely to see some of your prior colleagues here today, James, and has held many leadership roles in the UK as well. But I also have known James for some time and know that he's also been a policeman, a social worker, and the front man for a rock band. Tharani is the National Relationships Leader at Deloitte Australia, and she's responsible for strengthening Deloitte's relationships across all sectors and community, and has also been the National Leader for Deloitte's Social Impact Practice, with a real passion for bringing profit with purpose and connecting people across the ecosystem. She's also on several boards, including UNICEF and Settlement Services International, and has previously been on the Deloitte Foundation as well. More recently, Tharani and I have had lots of really incredible conversations about diversity, equity and inclusion, and it is wonderful to see you take the position of race and culture leader at Deloitte and to have another woman of colour on the panel tonight. And Mark is here today as he's a proud Birra, Gamilaroi and Bunjalung man, who is also the founder of Super Native Unlimited, chief there, and does a lot of work in cultural leadership development, as well as being the deep collaboration lead for Collaboration with Impact, one of the leading organisations for capacity building in placemaking work. Most recently, Mark has done some incredible work leading the joint campaign for Recognise and working on the official Yes campaign too. And I haven't had the opportunity to work with Mark, but I have been very influenced by your work, Mark, particularly through the publication of Lost Conversations, a wonderful book which talks about how Black and White Australia can lead together, a book that is open sourced and downloadable for free, but probably more important now than ever before. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. I'll now come and join you guys. Now, I know it's traditional to start by quoting your keynote speaker. But Charlie, I'm going to actually quote Amy to begin with. Amy ended her provocation to us by saying, "Success lies by tapping into that power, the power of ordinary people, people without titles like ours." And I wanted to build on your idea of power, and I will quote you now. I know in one of your publications you say, "It is almost impossible to shift the purpose of a system unless there is also a shift in who has power to determine how resources flow, what takes priority, who matters, and what is counted as a good outcome." I might go to Mark first, if you don't mind. Mark, I know all of us are thinking about how can we now better share power that we have. And I'm interested to know, in your work, where have you seen power shift within and to communities? And what's made that shift possible? And for well-meaning collaborators like all of us, what do we need to look and learn from?
Okay, thanks. It's great to be here, folks. Beyond Country here, visiting from Brisbane, Meanjin. So acknowledging that I'm here on other visitors' country and other First Nations here tonight. So there's the whole notion of power, right? So in power intelligence, power awareness work, there's a phrase we often use, which is we underestimate the power we have and we overestimate the power of others. So we find ourselves quite often going, "Oh, they've got heaps and heaps of power. I'm just little old me with nothing, can't do, limited resources. So many blockers, so many things that, I know that, Charlie, you've talked about before, where we build up our inhibitors, we build up our reasons for not doing. And yet, where we've seen the power of people to do stuff, to transform, to make real change, whether that's in local communities, like explained in Claymore. I'm familiar with Minnow, or just over the highway, in terms of local people saying, "No, we want to see change here. We're going to exercise and use our power." But also, we've seen, in the last week or so, the power of not using the power you've got, if that makes sense. We had 60% of Australians saying, "I don't have the imagination for that other thing. So, I don't think we can do it." And so just leaning back from that, we've misused our power. Misused not from the point of view like we all should have voted yes, but we lacked the imagination for the promise of change. And so we've reverted back. So whether it's a yes, no, that to me is less so. What matters more is that we had a moment of power to see change, and we chose to lean back from that. So we overestimated the power of someone else and underestimated our own power to make the change necessary.
Thanks, Mark. I want to name, one of the assumptions you named earlier, which is who has power. And James and Tharani, you're here as, representatives of corporate Australia and a government, people that we assume hold power in many occasions, or cultural power, economic power, political power. I'm keen to hear from you. Where are you seeing power shift? And how are you driving the sharing of power in your roles?
Thanks. When I think about power, and I would just slightly challenge something that Charlie said about good power and bad power. I think it's just power, and it's either well used or badly used. And I also think about power as a sort of finite resource. I think we get used to using the language of power. You use electricity, you generate more electricity if you need more electricity. If you thought about power, the kind of social, political, or governmental power that you're talking about, as finite, and if I wanted to share power with Tharani, I'd have less power. Because if I'm sharing my lunch with Tharani, I'm getting net less lunch. Tharani's getting some of my lunch. That's sharing. It's actually a redistribution. And what tends to happen, and I've seen in large organizations, corporations, governments as well, is a tendency to say, oh, okay, let's share power with another group. Okay, step one, generate more power so that we can give some over there but hold on to all of our own. And actually that's not power sharing, that's not even redistribution, that's just the status quo but differently imagined. Or I want this sort of power and I don't want to give away that kind of power. Really sharing power means you get less power. You have to give something up in order for someone else to have power and influence. And it's profoundly difficult. And just going to I just want to talk something about something that Amy said, which I thought about in relation to power. So I think you said the power, the choice to demolish Claymore and redevelop it was the people had the power to do that. The organizations had the power to do that. Just because you have power doesn't mean you get to use it badly. That's not a reason to use it as a reason actually to think very carefully about it. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think you've experienced some of that. But I think as the work that I try to do in developing coalitions is about this, is more profoundly this sense of how do we redistribute power? And actually organizations, governments, institutions have to have less power in order for other people to have more. And that sometimes is too much of a challenging proposition.
So I think the first thing I'd say is it's important that we talk about power. It's not talked about enough, and awareness is a really important place to start, because the more we have conversations, I think it puts a mirror up to people for them to reflect on their power, and then to James's point, how they use that power to affect change. The second thing I'd say is don't see power as a title, but see it as the combination of lived experience and titles and intellect. And how do you share your power to give those with the voices that maybe aren't always heard or represented the empowerment to be heard and represented? And, my biggest frustration is that a lot of tables where decisions are made do not reflect the diversity of the communities that they serve. And until we get a much more diverse set of voices at the table, we will not get to a fair, equitable, and truly inclusive Australia. So how I try and use my power with a brand like Deloitte is have these conversations. How do we get diverse people, the coalitions from government, business, social sector, community together to talk about and to look for opportunities to share that power? And I'll give you a good example. There's a lot of discussion around the climate transition, but it's always either corporates talking about the climate transition or investors talking about how they're going to finance the transition. What about the voices of those in the communities that are bearing the brunt of the climate inaction, that have not actually been the cause of a lot of the challenges? So how do we get those voices heard and part of the kind of coming together to design solutions for the future?
Thank you. So one place to start would be Mark's point about the other side are often overestimating your power. The really striking thing about the referendum for me was that it was as if the First Nations population of Australia was about to launch an insurrection unless we're careful, and we're deeply threatened by a group who feel absolutely powerless. And what people do, we're doing this in the UK with immigration at the moment, is that the weakest people are painted as the biggest threat. And it's an extraordinary kind of inversion. So that also, however, makes one think, well, maybe there's more power than we realize in some sense. I think I do agree, I half agree with James in the sense that I think you do need to shift power, but often within the public sector there's a lot of shifting of power, and it makes no difference whether it's central or local, or it's this department, that department. There's a lot of ways of shifting the power that just becomes shuffling power. And so shift is different. And I think one mark of a shift is it generates power. So you want a shift that then generates power. So when Alec Mansky shifted power to young people and their families, that then had a generative effect thereafter. And when Alvaro created his community health system, it created a sort of generation of power across the community. Do you see what I mean? Everyone became more powerful. So I think I am really interested in that, that process of, I think these things generate power where it isn't currently, as well as redistributing it. And the final thing is just to reflect that we think of power, I think, often as the power to act, to do things. And I think, for instance, philanthropy and foundations, often we fund people to do things, run programs. And you have the power to act in certain situations. Actually, most of the time, power is conferred by situations. It's not conferred by action. It's the situation that tells you whether you're powerful. And you walk into a situation, whether it's a classroom, a hospital, or a court, and you know whether you're powerful. So actually, if you really want to change power, you've got to change situations, not just actions. And that's a real challenge, I think, for philanthropy and for government, is that by and large, we don't fund people to change situations or contexts. We fund people to do stuff that they can then tell us they've done and then report back on it. And I think that, it'd be interesting in your job, James, whether you feel the power to not just act, but to shift situations as well, I suppose.
Thanks, Charlie. I wanted to pick up on that idea of shuffling and shifting, and sort of talk a little bit about possibility and draw on Mark's point about imagination. I know, thinking about Karen asking, what if? Some of your work encourages us to focus on possibility of new and different futures rather than just optimising what we have now. But it's hard in complex and uncertain times to do that. And it's easy to focus on the limitations and the constraints around us. As leaders, I'm interested to know, what's your advice for shifting mindsets to focus on possibility? And where are you seeing that in practice now? What can we do differently? Anyone? James?
Everyone's very shy about having the microphone, aren't they? Thanks. I think one of the things about the possibilities that there are, or the important thing, I think, to hold on to when thinking about making change happen, is you've got to get out of your echo chamber. Stop talking to people who agree with you. Talk to people who disagree with you. Arrogant people who disagree with you will always tell you exactly why they disagree with you, and will also, if you ask them, tell you how they plan to stop you in your ambition, because they can't help themselves. Partly because of desperation, because I might never get the chance to stop you, so I'm going to tell you now how I'm going to stop you. If we don't talk to people who we wouldn't necessarily choose to have a drink with, we will only ever come up with solutions for people who think like us. And people who think like us, as we discovered in the last few weeks, are not everybody. And if we're stupid enough to think that everybody thinks like us, then bad things can happen. So in terms of forming coalitions, you've really got to be prepared to speak to the people you don't want to talk to, but also in bringing those groups together, be really, really open about what you're prepared to hear and not going in with a preformed view of, and this is where I have to say governments are particularly notorious, of saying, I'm going to have a consultation with you. Please tell me what I've already got on my prepared list of ideas for your community, and we'll go together and I'll make you think that you came up with it and actually we'd already predetermined what it was. You've got to be better than that. But it's not great fun doing it. And talking to people who disagree with you is hard work. But and the easy work is to talk to people who agree with you all the time, but it doesn't make a difference. So,
Okay, so imagining new possibilities, right? It's nice. It's a great exercise to invoke our intellect, to use our imagination to go beyond. And interestingly, that was the first point, go beyond the reality. So in our work at Collaboration for Impact, Deep Collaboration, we almost have a dance move for this. I'm not going to demonstrate, but it is kind of, you see the reality and you have to stare at that tough reality, but you've also got to look beyond it for possibilities. And so that's the dance move, right? You can just kind of embellish that and just move a little bit. But you have to see the tough reality first. And it's difficult, it's oppositional, it's contested, and you're actually part of it. And that's the part that really hurts, is that you've contributed to this tough reality that sits in front of you. You're connected to it. So then you go, okay, new imagination, new way of going, and there's always this gravitational pull back to the system will want to keep the way it is. It self-survives, it sustains itself, it's entrenched for a reason. So I've been thinking lately that systems change is like a faith crisis, because we're asking people to challenge their fundamental belief in reality. It's nice to be able to say, look for a new horizon, go to the third or fourth horizon if you really want to be radical, right? Go fourth, fifth horizon. But the reality is like, we're asking people to challenge a fundamental belief in reality. That's a faith crisis. Who am I? How do I be? What will happen? That makes me afraid. And that makes me drawn towards that gravitational pull to safety, to shelter, back to where I know. And if I have to stare at this reality and go, oh, well, it'd be nice to change power, it'd be nice to shift power, it would be good to consult you better, but we've got to get it done by April. We've got to get it done quickly. We've got to put an evaluation on it, And so this gravitational pull back is why I think it's an actual faith crisis. It's not just about good ideas. Yeah.
Thanks. You both encouraged us to get uncomfortable. Tharani, your advice?
I think I'll build on both of what the others have said. I think the first thing I'd say is, I see a lot of conversations and it's the same kind of organisations. NGOs talking to one another about an issue, corporates talking to one another about an issue, government agencies talking to one another about an issue. So the more deliberate we can be to bring those diverse players together around community, we're going to force more deeper conversations around the challenges, the obstacles, and the opportunity. And I'd encourage you to stand with partners that are the unusual suspects, that no one would expect you to stand beside, because that gets attention and it gets interest in terms of, what is happening here that might create a new possibility and a new future. And then the second thing I'd say is ask why not? What would it take? I don't think we ask those questions enough. And if people are afraid, try it in something small, a small pilot, a small proof of concept. Prove the story to get the interest, to generate the momentum, to get to scale.
So I think there is I think the reason we need radical imagination is precisely because there is so much breakdown stress, the poly crisis, all the rest of it. I want to sort of create the poly possibility. What if we could create a plurality of possibilities that was as big, larger than the crises that we face? And actually, to be honest, compared to, say, when I left university, which is now sort of 40 years ago, actually there are a load more ideas around now. There's much more radical thinking. Actually, I actually don't think we're short of ideas. I think we're short of action. We're short of understanding how to turn radical ideas into new systems. So I would be less pessimistic about that. I think the crises are calling forth imagination, and to some extent that's coming. I think it would help if all organizations invested in imagination properly and a muscle of imagining and getting people out. I think that what the panelists said about actually change involves conflict and openness about conflict, and saying that up front, that counts. And I think, Mark, you're absolutely right that it's difficult because it touches people's identity, belonging, purpose, safety. But those people are often also banging their heads against walls every day in systems that confound them. So one of the things to look for are systems where the people within them are as frustrated in this cramped, uncomfortable middle where they're doing things they consider unacceptable, and so are the people on the receiving end. Because that's where you then start to create elements of the coalition that James talked about. And I'm struck by how many of these things start sort of 20 years before they get really any traction with voices in the wilderness, with people who are really, really odd, you know. So veganism in the developed world starts with a woodwork teacher called Donald Watson, who in the war in 1944 goes to stay on his uncle's farm and sees 2 pigs slaughtered and decides he's never going to eat meat again. And in 1946, he launches the Vegan Society. What happens to the Vegan Society? Well, for about 50 years, it's utterly marginal. But actually, that idea then becomes absolutely catalytic in about 10 years. So a lot of this, I think that organizations in this sector who I think have become too dependent on government, too driven by service, need to promote voices in the wilderness as well, to learn where those sort of radical ideas about the future might be coming from.
Thanks, Charlie. You've told us about Donald, Karen, Alvaro and Alan now. And Uncle Alan reminded us of the great leaders that have gone before us on this land before. I'm keen to hear from the other panellists. When you think about radical collaboration, when you think about the work that we need to do, who are the leaders that come to mind for you? Tharani?
So someone who, from a corporate perspective, I have admired is Paul Pullman, who used to be the CEO of Unilever, who has really pushed for a greater discussion around climate and getting more actors from across the ecosystem to focus on it and to think longer term, not short term, go against the quarterly reporting that drives poor decisions around investment and playing the long game. So for me, people that are willing to challenge the norms and, take a stance on social issues and be courageous, even if they're not the typical leader that you would expect to take a stance, is what I think we should, celebrate more. If I reflect on, what's happened in the last month, a lot of corporates, got into grief for taking a stance on the referendum. Like, I think that a healthy society equals, healthy business and vice versa. So the more diverse players own the problem and speak, or, own the solution, and speak to it, the better.
That's a really tricky question. I happen to be reading, fortunately for me, I suppose, a book about Shackleton, which is a bit I know Shackleton has a reputation as a bit of a boy's own hero, but actually the story is fascinating because he has a clear idea about what his objective is. And within a few weeks of commencing the journey, it just all goes to ruin. They get stuck in an ice pack in the boat, and they're there for nearly a year. And stuck in the ice, and then eventually the ship sinks, and then they get onto the ice floe, and then they turn one of the lifeboats into a sailing ship and sail across the Southern Ocean. That becomes the story in reverse. It's an incredible story, but he completely failed to actually his objective, which was to walk across, walk to the South Pole. Everybody conveniently forgets that he completely failed in his objective because they're mesmerised by the story of what he did achieve. But what he achieved, he was continually adapting. He adapted himself, he adapted the people around him, he adapted the equipment that he had. He did this thing where he avoided what's called functional fixedness. So he stopped seeing things for what they had been designed for and saw them as something else. So an iceberg, which is crushing you to death in the middle of an ice floe, is actually an enormous platform that you can all climb out onto and be rescued by. And I think that kind of in-the-moment adaptation is incredibly important in leaders. And it's something which is, rarely, I think, not particularly well understood. But I think there are a lot of leadership stories where people have prevailed through kind of radical adaptation on their journey, and sometimes haven't actually achieved the objective they set out to achieve, but no one talks about that anymore. So that would be mine.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to tell a little story, right? Take about 3 or 4 hours. Should be fine. And Crystal, just to note, get you ready. I'm going to name you in a minute, so just prepare yourself. In the same way, because we're here in a church building, in the same way that in the Christian faith they have the Eucharist, the Lord's table, right? That is a very modern thing we do to remember a very ancient thing that happened. And we do that in order to bring that ceremony into our present reality, our current context. One of the things, I think, the gifts about First Nations ways of knowing, being and doing is that ability to do that similar thing. Through our current ceremony, we remember generations past. And I link that to the systems work around going long, right? The whole notion of thinking generationally as opposed to thinking political cycles or CEO cycles, or if only that committee stays in place, we've got a chance. How do you actually hold a generation to say, I'm doing my work, but I'm just holding this as a generation and it's going to pass it on? So when you said leaders who've done collaboration, I think about the 2 leaders from this area, Benelong and Pemulwuy, who for different reasons tried to seek, how do we keep our peoples alive? One of them saying, stop moving into what we now know as Western Sydney. You can't bring your colony here. And the other one was like, we need to figure out how to get along with these mob. Otherwise, you know, fast forward 200 years and we're going to be in a situation where we need to know this. And so that embodiment of partnering but also standing firmly is embodied by Crystal. So to bring that into the modern era, that's an ancient way of knowing and being, and it goes all the way through 200 years, and you find it in people like Crystal, like other First Nations leaders who are having to hold, how do I hold our people and present our people, but also how do I reach out and continue to partner and collaborate? And yeah, so I'm just naming you, dropping you in that. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Crystal. And on that note, I really want to thank you four as leaders for us today and for times ahead. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, James. Thank you, Tharani. And thank you, Charlie, for all your wisdom and some dance moves as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Our very own inspirational leader right here in the room. In fact, we're so blessed to have such a collection of leaders in the room today, all thinking about the wisdom that the panellists and that Charlie's shared with us tonight. I think, you know, those concepts of sharing power, building coalitions, but also coalitions with people that you wouldn't normally hang out with, getting out of that echo chamber. And, you know, that recognition that the ambitions that we all have will not only, you know, take the patience and going wide and going long and going deep, all of those things, but, you know, that acknowledgement that it's profoundly difficult work, and avoiding that generational, you know, pull that's always going to keep taking us back towards the status quo. It's been really, really wonderful to have you all reflect and also on Charlie's presentation to us, and I think gives us great hope. So a big thank you again to Tammy and our panel. We have just one or two more very special things for this evening, and I'd like to invite Heather Watson, the chair of Uniting, to come and to join me out the front here, because we're going to present a very special award that Uniting has developed to recognise political figures who walk the talk, sometimes putting their career on the line and using their platform to inspire social justice because it's the right thing to do. This year, the Award for Political Courage, it is our inaugural year. We announced the formation of the award last year, but it's our inaugural awarding of it this year. And it is going to someone who really did literally refuse to toe the party line, who really did bring that much needed bipartisan lens to the Voice to Parliament debate. Many of you will know that this politician quit the shadow front bench of the Liberal Party and became a backbencher, really standing by what he believed so that he could support the voice to Parliament. And by doing so, he demonstrated his integrity and his bold pursuit of fairness and compassion in defiance of party politics. Please welcome the inaugural winner of Uniting New South Wales ACT's Award for Political Courage to the stage, and that is Federal MP Julian Leeser. Julian, please come and share a few words with us.
It's a very daunting task to follow such a distinguished group of speakers that we've heard this evening. Can I begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging? Can I acknowledge the chair of Uniting, Heather Watson, and Tracy Burton? Can I acknowledge the moderator, Marta? Congratulations on your recent election there. It's been wonderful to engage with you. Can I acknowledge Harry Herbert's family, Meg Herbert and Catherine? And can I acknowledge Charlie, Tammy, Amy, James, Tharani and Mark for what has been a spellbinding evening this evening. And particularly Amy, I want to acknowledge what you said about listening, because as it applied to your community in Claymore, so that was the whole point of the idea of the voice behind the referendum too. I'm honoured and humbled to receive this award for Uniting New South Wales and ACT, and it's particularly an honour to be the first recipient of this award, and particularly more so even as a Jewish Australian. As a Jewish Australian, I want to acknowledge the wonderful friendship that I have had over many years with many people across the various churches of Australia who contribute so much to the spiritual and material wealth of our country. I was educated by Anglicans, and before I became a Member of Parliament, I spent those 4 years immediately prior working for the largest mission of the Catholic Church. In particular, I want to acknowledge the positive influence of the Uniting Church and that it has had on my own life. For the last 5 years, I have been working with a wonderful woman called Annette McHugh. She's been a wonderful advisor and friend, and there are people in this room who know her well. Her own faith formation influenced the character of the leadership she brought to my team and her view of public policy. This should be no surprise, as her late father, the Reverend Dr. Peter Pereira, was a proud son of this church and a former director of mission of Uniting Care. In that role, he was the direct successor to the Reverend Harry Herbert, who we acknowledge this evening. Can I also acknowledge my friend Stu Cameron, who's here, and his predecessor, Keith Garner, with whom I've worked so closely in one of my other great passions, that is in particular addressing the terrible rates of suicide in this country, which remains one of the great passions of my period in public life. In accepting this award, which is an award for virtue, I'm reminded of the old story of the church that presented one of its congregants with a medal for their humility and then promptly took the medal off the recipient after they started wearing it. It's right that we're reflecting on the referendum with the Uniting Church. You played an important role, and in my experience of that campaign. In that sense, you've carried on a tradition that goes back to the role that the church has played during the Federation debates in the 1890s, and even before that, and it's an honour to be in a church that has the Bible of the Reverend John Dungmore Lang downstairs in the hall, one of the early thinkers about democracy in this country. One of the first local events I did was at the Thornley Uniting Church, and it's the church of my friend and your former moderator, Jim Mean. It's a wonderful local community that brings together the young and the old. And one of the last events I did was a gathering at Epping Uniting Church just outside my electorate. It was a bipartisan event. It was one of those lovely occasions that are so reminiscent of events at the Uniting Church, where after the formalities are over, you stay and linger over a cup of tea with a milk arrowroot biscuit and a chat. At both events, I was joined by the amazing Brooke Prentice, who's a wonderful Indigenous Christian leader and who spoke so meaningfully about the Church and Indigenous Australians. And at Thornley, I want to acknowledge that I appeared on a panel with Nathan Tyson, your Director of First People Strategy. And of course, it was also wonderful to be at the launch of the Uniting Yes campaign at Ashfield Uniting Church with Bill Cruz. Bill, of course, has given new meaning to the miracle of the loaves and fishes, having fed people almost every day for 40 years. Throughout all of these events, I was reminded of the wonderful words of somebody who's been a great spiritual mentor to me, the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who once said, "A community is a place where everybody knows your name and where they miss you when you're not there." And that's what you do at Uniting. Uniting builds communities. I want to thank Uniting for making communities right across Australia. I have to confess that in accepting this award, I felt many conflicting emotions. The first is my gratitude, but that gratitude is tempered by my feelings for Indigenous Australians who are feeling at the very least bruised at this time, and we all need to be mindful of that. I repeat what I said on referendum night. We need each other, we belong to each other, we share this land, and we must walk together so that we can close the gaps between us. The late Reverend Peter Marshall, the chaplain to the United States Senate, once said, "It's better to fail in a cause that will ultimately succeed than to succeed in a cause that will ultimately fail." I believe in the cause of reconciliation, and I believe it's a cause that will ultimately succeed. It will be different to what we imagined 10 days ago, but it will succeed. And it will and it must because of the necessity of closing the gap. Because the education, health, housing and safety gaps that exist should not exist in a country as wealthy and prosperous as Australia. I've reflected a little on the ideal that you're acknowledging today, the ideal of courage. I believe the foundation of courage is the idea of conviction, the willingness to stand alone for what you believe. I like to think that I do that every day, as do most members of the Parliament that I serve in across the political spectrum. Mostly our convictions run with the political party or grouping we belong to, and for me that's the Liberal Party. Mostly I hold orthodox liberal and conservative views. I believe in the Crown, in institutions, in the Constitution as the mediator of the power of this country. I believe in the rights, freedoms and dignities of the individual, including their right to follow their own faith if they have a faith and to choose their own path. I understand the limitations of government, best expressed through lower taxes, and that we grow economies through opportunity and incentive. I believe in liberal democratic ideals and the ballot box as the arbiter of our differences. My point is that public life is an invitation to act courageously by advocating for your convictions. One of the points I made on referendum night was to acknowledge the skill, strength and courage of Indigenous leaders who advocated both for and against the voice. And I want to speak their names here because collectively they brought Indigenous leadership to the fore in our country over recent months. I want to acknowledge yes leaders like Linda Burney, Noel Pearson, Malandiri McCarthy, Dean Parkin, Pat Dodson, Ken Wyatt, Karen Mundine, Marcia Langton, Rachel Perkins and scores of others, as well as no leaders Jacinta Price, Karen Little and Warren Mundine. I'm in awe of their shared leadership. Together they give me hope. Though many of them are hurting, I say our country needs their leadership. Yes, it needs their voices, as well as it needs the voices of Indigenous Christian leaders too. Friends, in accepting this award tonight, I want to say a few words that you might not expect me to say given my political tradition. Tonight I want to acknowledge and praise one of the essential tenets of my party, the Liberal Party. And that might seem a strange thing to do when I've been campaigning yes and almost everyone else in my federal party room has supported the no case. But that's exactly my point. My party, the Liberal Party, allows its backbenchers the freedom to speak out and campaign against the party position. In the other parties, I'd be expelled for acting on my convictions. Yes, along with Bridget Archer and Andrew Bragg, we were the only parliamentarians in the federal parliament from my party to advocate a different view from our own party. But that's to the Liberal Party's credit. We're allowed to disagree, to challenge and to engage with a different view. My call to the Labor Party is to forsake the binding pledge that they forced their members to sign. It's an antiquated relic of the past. And to the Greens, to formalise the right of conscience rather than the rigid demand for ideological compliance. It's time that those parties gave their members and senators the same freedom that we have, because conscience matters and change only occurs when the status quo is challenged, and challenged internally. One of the lessons of this past year is that we need more persuasion, more negotiation, more compromise and more common ground in our politics in this country. As I said earlier in the year, the problem with an all or nothing approach is that it may well leave us with nothing. All of us in public life have to work harder to find common ground, to engage in the messiness of interacting with others outside the political tribe and tradition. It was Gough Whitlam, the brother of the former moderator of this church, Freda Whitlam, who made the unusual observation about politics and about what and how we advocate for change. Given the previous discussion has been about power, it was interesting to hear him say, "Only the impotent are pure." It's a very Whitlam-esque quote and perhaps not necessarily appropriate for a church, but his point is there are always trade-offs when we seek to deliver change. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And that means that political life isn't just about courage and conviction, it's about compromise and negotiation. It's about engaging with that messiness, and most of that doesn't look like courage, but it actually is. It takes courage to listen and to engage with difference. I said many times during the referendum that I've been taking solace in reading the debates of the 1890s of federation. I'm inspired by that generation of leaders who wrote our Constitution. One of my takeaways from that reading is that none of the framers, no one, got absolutely everything they were wanting, either from the federation debates or the votes. Our great federation was the result of compromise and finding common ground. And in this context, it means even despite our disappointment in the referendum result, that we must keep engaging. We must stay on the path of reconciliation. None of us must walk away. We must show courage, and equally we must listen well. The process is messy, but we must focus our work on our service and on the country and on the generations to follow. I'm sure I might be the first to quote this at this award, but I'm sure I won't be the last. Over a century ago, the United States President Teddy Roosevelt described what this sort of work is like. He said, and I'll quote, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man," and you'll have to excuse the dated gendered language here, "who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows that in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." I haven't been alone in this journey over the past year. There were tens of thousands of Australians who supported the Yes case, and I honour them. To all those who feel as if their faces are marred by dust and sweat and blood, I say stay engaged. Continue the work of making our country a better place. We must continue on the path of reconciliation because we need each other. We belong to each other. We share this land. And that must be the sentiment that guides us all on the road ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julian, for speaking of hope and certainty that indeed, that we will all be in the arena and the world will be made a better place right here in Australia, particularly for our First Nations people. And your courage has definitely been a significant contributing factor to that, along with all of those amazing First Nations leaders that you've acknowledged in your presentation today. To close this evening, I'm delighted to now welcome the moderator of the Uniting Church. And Marta has been another amazing campaigner for social justice. Reverend Marta Havea Helio is going to provide our closing reflections and our blessing for the evening. So Marta, thank you.
I begin by acknowledging our First Nations men, women and children of this Gadigal country, of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders who have passed, the elders that continue to lead new emerging young Indigenous, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander leaders into the future. As a uniting church, we will always, post-referendum, continue to walk and work and covenant with our First Nations people for justice and equality and hope. I first met Reverend Harry Herbert in 1999. And as a young Pacifica Island Tongan girl, to hear someone stand in the public space and talk about abortion, talk about an injecting centre, the possibility of that, to talk about gay and lesbian, talk about drugs and AIDS was pretty confronting and, whoa, scary and courageous. In 1999 also, I first met Meg Herbert. She was the Dean of the Uniting Church Theological College, where I was a first-year student beginning my degree of a Bachelor of Theology to work and to minister in the life of the church. I was a young girl who grew up in Wiradjuri country and had hopped in my little car, leaving my young child behind with mum and dad, and headed to UTC to live on site. I grew up on housing commission and didn't have much money. My dean saw that I was needing an extra cash, so I was tasked to babysit Catherine at their home in Chatswood. I remember one day when my daughter came to live with me at the theological college. One day, a removalist van pulled up and out came this brand new single bed. For the first time, my 5-year-old child received her first new bed. This evening, we talk about intergenerational disadvantage. Tonight, firstly, I am deeply honoured as a moderator, as a leader of the Uniting Church for the state of New South Wales and ACT. I want to present Meg Herbert and Catherine, a small token of uniting of Tracy and Heather's, small token of our appreciation, honouring the mighty work that your husband, father, offered not only the church, but to the wider Australian community. I want to present you with this small token of our appreciation. Julian, Charlie, Amy, our panellists, I'm sure all of us will agree what an inspiration, wisdom and gifts that you have offered us this evening. All of us, in one way or another, are here to stand for justice and hope. Tracy began in gathering us this evening by saying we are here to listen, we are here to learn, We are here to be inspired by one another in our stories to stand, and the wisdom that you've shared, to stand for structural change, to make impact for the intergenerational injustices that are happening all around us. I want to invite all of us this evening as a closing blessing to put your hand up if you are left-handed. Put your hand up if you are right-handed. If you put that in front of you and pretend and imagine that it's a mirror, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? Are you seeing hope? Are you loving what you're seeing, or are you questioning what you're seeing? If you turned that around and reflected to our community and our world, what are we seeing? War happening around our world. First Nations people just being really challenged. What are we seeing? In closing this evening, our blessing is this. Each and every one of us brings something wonderful and powerful in order to make the systemic change and intergenerational change that we need to be able to see a church, to see a community, and to see a world that is about loving each other just as much as we want to be loved. And tonight as we go, we want to thank all of you, all of our guests, all of United. We want to thank each and every one of you for your presence here this evening. But may it not just be your presence. May it be an inspiration to go out and to do the little or the most you can to ensure that change will happen in a bigger and wonderful way. I didn't know how I was going to end this, so let me just offer a blessing. My brothers and sisters in God, as you go out this evening, may the blessing of God, God who is hope, God who is love, God who is joy, and God who is our light, go out with you this evening and remain with you always. Amen.
We can't end any better than that. Thank you, moderator, and thank you again, everyone, for being here. Our social impact and advocacy team, I think, will be really delighted that we've created such an amazing event. We're deeply grateful to all of them, and I'm sure they would really want me to say to you, thank you for being here, a very special occasion to mark an incredibly special human being. Thank you.